The two men charged with murder in this case told police that they thought Ahmaud Arbery had burglarized a home. But a family attorney says there is no evidence that there was ever a crime committed. And the homeowner says that he never asked the McMichaels to get involved. Joe Henke explains.
These video clips from February 23rd show a man appearing to be Ahmaud Arbery entering a home under construction, walking around inside, and then leaving. The home is owned by a man named Larry English. His attorney released a lengthy statement to 11 Alive today, saying English's motion-activated security camera recorded a series of other unauthorized entries at night last October. And Mr. English has never said that Mr. Arbery was the person or persons in any of those nighttime videos. The statement goes on to say English was 2 hours away from his Satilla Shores neighborhood home on February 23rd. He received an alert the camera had been activated, but did not watch the clip for about 20 minutes. When he did, he called the neighbor and asked if they could see someone in the house. And the neighbor told English a man who would later be identified as Arbery had just been killed in the neighborhood. Gregory and Travis McMichael are the father and son later arrested for Arbery's murder. In the statement, English's attorney wrote he never used the word burglary. He never shared any of this information with the McMichaels, whom he did not even know. Nothing was ever stolen from the house, which again was a construction site. English's attorney also stated if anything was stolen or damaged, English would never have wanted a vigilante response, did not ask the McMichaels to do anything, and does not want to be any part of an effort to justify their actions. And a separate previously released video shows the actual shooting of Arbery. It was recorded by a different man. We have already heard from his attorney, but coming up at 6, hear directly from the man behind the camera.
Thanks, Joe. You can continue to follow our coverage on this case on 11alive.com.